Greetings, context of white supremacy. This is Justice and Gus tuning in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on what racism, white supremacy is and how it works. Chat room is closed today and will be closed indefinitely. I will make a decision when I am ready to open the chat room up again. Justice, are you there?
This is Dorothy Roberts here. Is that who you expected?
Yes, expected you to be there as well, and I hope that my co-host Justice is on the line with me as well. Justice, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Outstanding. How are you doing?
I am doing fine.
Outstanding. We're ready to roll. As you already heard, I am very pleased to have on the program today author of Killing the Black Body. She is a law professor at Northwestern University. She has written numerous articles that have been published in journals all over the country. She's actually written other books besides Killing the Black Body. I'm very happy. I think she's going to have a lot of important information to share with us today. I feel like this is probably one of the most responsible shows I have done, Professor Dorothy Roberts. And you've already heard she is here. How are you doing, Professor?
Yeah, I'm doing well. I'm unfortunately on a cell phone right now. I'm trying to make my way to a landline, so I hope the connection is okay.
I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, then I'll continue like this. I'm approaching a destination right now. I'm sorry about that. My timing was a little off today.
Not a problem. I completely understand. I'm very appreciative for you taking the time to hang out with us today and share information about your fantastic book. So thank you.
Sure, it's my pleasure.
Ours. The pleasure is ours. Could you share, I guess, any constructive information or helpful information with our listeners about who you are and the work that you do?
Oh, sure. Well, as you said, I'm a professor at Northwestern University School of Law in Chicago, and I've been a law professor for 20 years now. I'm also an activist and a writer, and in addition to Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty, I also have a book called Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, which that one is about race and the child welfare system. And I have been advocating primarily for women of color and reproductive justice. And sorry, I'm on a radio interview right now. I'm sorry for the disruption. And working to try to bring attention to racism in systems like the incarceration system, child welfare, criminal justice more broadly as well.
Okay, outstanding. I am hopefully using this program as an audition to have you back if you feel that this program is constructive and not a waste of your time and energy. Hopefully we can get you back to talk about some of your other...
Sure, I'd love to. Okay, and I'm settled now in a quiet room. So.
Okay.
And again, I'm sorry for...
No problem. No worries. But definitely, I looked at some of your essays, particularly Adoption Myths and Racial Realities in the United States. And I think my listeners would very much like to hear more about that. So hopefully this one will go great, and we can have you back to talk about some of your other excellent work that I think is very important for non-white people. I guess to get started, you are a black female, that's correct?
Yes, that's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. This program, the C.O.W.S, Context of White Supremacy, I have concluded, unfortunately, that we are in a system of white supremacy, and the definition that I use for white supremacy is a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white. Do you feel that such a system exists, and do you think that that is an accurate definition for that system?
I think that system does exist, and I think that's an excellent definition because it highlights what the meaning of whiteness is. I happen to be working on a book on genetics and race and the resurgence of the idea that race is a biological category. And so I've just, for the last month, been writing exactly on this question of what is the meaning of race and pointing out that race is a political system. And one way of knowing that is if you think about what does it mean to be white. The only definition, the only criterion for whiteness is that it gives you a privilege that nobody else has. There's no biological definition because who's considered white has changed over the centuries. It's sort of, this privileged group, and people have fought to be part of it legally and politically. And the point of being part of that group is that you are considered to be superior. You have privileges and powers that other people don't have. And there are a host of institutions and systems, laws in place, et cetera, markets in place, all aspects of our lives in place to try to preserve the power of people who are white. And so, yeah, I think that your definition was right on.
Outstanding, outstanding. My co-host, partner in this endeavor, Justice, she is 10, and although she's not my daughter, if I had a daughter, she would be on the line with me doing this show because I feel this is incredibly important, especially for any non-white female in the world. Justice, do you have any questions that you would like to ask Professor Roberts?
I do have one question.
Go right ahead.
What you said earlier? What other books did you read? Did you write?
Well, let me tell you about my two main books. I've written some case books for law students as well, but my two main books are Killing the Black Body, which is about the attempts to control the reproduction of women of color, especially black women, and how reproductive control or population control has been an integral aspect of white supremacy and has shaped the way that we think about the meaning of reproductive freedom in this country. So the struggles that women have had for reproductive freedom for throughout the centuries have been shaped in this country by racism, and policies that affect reproduction have been shaped by racism. And then conversely, those policies are a key element of preserving white supremacy in this country, both practically in the sense that there have been efforts to keep non-white people from having children, at least when it wasn't profitable after the end of slavery to produce children who were the property of white masters. But also in the sense that the idea that the reason why there's social inequality in this country is because people of color are having too many babies. That idea, which has been around for hundreds of years and was especially strong during the eugenics period, but also has continued through the 1960s and 70s and in policies to this day, is a way of taking attention away from white supremacy and making people believe that the reason for non-white people's in the unequal status is because it's their own fault. They're having too many children. And then that book led me to another book, Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, when I began to notice that not only were there policies that punished black women for having children, that affected their reproductive decision-making and their pregnancy, that there were policies that led to their children being removed from them after they were born at far higher numbers than white children. And so I wanted to investigate why it was that most of the children in foster care in this country are children of color, and why black children and also Native American children are removed at far higher rates, why there are whole neighborhoods where high percentages of children have been removed from their homes and placed in foster care, and what was the political impact and significance of so much state control over families. And I argued that that policy to deal with the struggles of poor black families by taking their children away from them and putting them in state custody is a form of racism that also helps to perpetuate white supremacy. Also in very practical terms, in the sense that it disrupts families, it disrupts communities. It literally places children in state custody. I mean, that's literally what it does. But it also has an ideological impact, which is to tell the rest of society that black families, black parents can't take care of their children. And again, the reasons for the problems that black children have, it's not because of structural inequities, it's because their parents don't know how to take care of them. And so those are the two main books I've published, and as I said, I'm working now on a new book looking at the rise in genetic science that claims to prove that race is biological. And I think it has, again, a very similar effect of convincing people that the reason for continued racial inequities in this country have to do with something natural about black people, that we're naturally inferior. It's in our genes, not because we are subjected to racist policies and institutions and systems. So that's my trilogy of books that, and I think, some people have said, well, why are you working on genetics? What does that have to do with mass incarceration and foster care? And my answer is I think that I fear that this focus on race and genetics is going to be a way of legitimizing the systems like the prison system and the foster care system and the welfare system that keep blacks and other non-whites in a subordinated position in this country. So, does that answer your question?
Yes.
Good.
But I couldn't really understand it.
You do or you don't?
I don't understand it, but some of it I do.
Well, if you have any questions about it, feel free to ask me. I know that was a lot.
I don't have any questions right now.
Okay. Well, thanks for your question, and hopefully you'll be able to understand some of it, and then as you get older, you can, if you are interested and care about these issues, which I'm sure you are, it'll become clearer and clearer to you.
Okay.
That is the hope. That is the hope.
Yes. Well, it sounds like she's off to a good start.
Oh, she's phenomenal. She's an all-star at 10. I don't think I had her clarity at 20, but
yes, right. Yeah. Yes.
I wanted to your book, Killing the Black Body. I want the listeners, one term I would like them to keep in mind during this broadcast, Mr. Neely Fuller Jr., population tailoring in terms of the system of white supremacy, not necessarily looking to commit acts of genocide and killing every black person or every non-white person, but definitely looking to tailor populations so that you can control how many people are in specific areas. We don't want the numbers getting too high, so doing things to keep the numbers down to a number that you are comfortable with that will help maintain the system of white supremacy. So if you can keep that in mind, population tailoring.
Yes, and
go on. Go ahead. Oh, please, go ahead.
And it's also known as population control as well. And I think it's very important, this is a point I emphasize in Killing the Black Body, to understand that in this country and also around the world as a result of policies largely originating in the United States, the birth control and family planning have had a dark side to them. And I think very often today people think of birth control as being liberating and believing that there was a period where women got reproductive freedom, and since then everyone has been able to make legally protected by the Constitution reproductive decisions for themselves. And many people don't know that from the very beginning of the birth control movement in this country in the early 1920s, that it's always been linked to not individual freedom, but alone, but largely and essentially to population control, to the idea that birth control, the purpose of it, originally wasn't to give women greater control over their lives, but to control populations that were considered to be inferior so that they wouldn't have as many children. I mean, the birth control in the United States emerged at the same time as the eugenics movement in this country, and they emerged together. And eugenics is the philosophy that people inherit their not only illnesses but also personality traits, and that it is because of inheritance that we have social problems. And therefore, the way to solve social problems is to keep people with so-called defective heredity from having children and to increase the procreation, the childbearing of people who are believed to have superior heredity. And so when birth control was introduced in the United States, it was introduced at a time where that philosophy was the reigning philosophy in this country. It was taught in colleges. It was the official policy of the United States government and most states in this country. Half of the states had mandatory sterilization laws that compelled the sterilization of people who were considered to be genetically inferior. And the U.S. government passed immigration policy based on a eugenics philosophy, at the time believing that Southern Europeans were genetically inferior to Northern Europeans. And so the influx of Greeks and Slavs and Jews and Italians should be limited because they were considered to be defective stock, it was called. And so, and then we can look at the history of family planning in America and see that it was used to target black women who were sometimes not only given without their knowledge or full consent birth control, but also sterilized up into the 1970s. And there's evidence to suggest that it continues to this day, that black women are sterilized at higher rates and do not have fully informed consent or give fully informed consent about it. That's controversial, but certainly there's very clear evidence that black women were pressured to be sterilized without their full consent through the 1970s. And women on Puerto Rico, for example, there was a huge government-backed campaign to sterilize women on that island that went on for decades. so this is part of the history of birth control, this idea of using family planning to control populations. And I think it's important to recognize, as I mentioned earlier, that the purpose is not just to physically limit populations. There's also a very powerful ideological message that goes along with it, which is that the government needs to limit the population, these populations, because they're harmful to society and they're harmful to themselves. They're the cause of social problems. This is a very, very powerful belief that has infected a whole host of policies and just the way that many Americans think about social inequality in this country. The belief that people are poor, people are poorly educated, people are in prison, people don't have jobs because there's something inherently wrong with them. Not that they're the victims of unjust social structures and systems and institutions, but it's in their bodies that's the problem. And so if you think that way, then the solution is to keep more of those bodies from being born. And the harm is not just in, it is a major harm to control someone's reproductive decisions, but the harm is spread even beyond the individuals who lack or have less control than they should over their own bodies to affect the way in which people think about social problems and the need for social change. Because there's no need for social change if you think the reason for the problems is located in people's bodies. And then you don't have to change society. You just have to either lock up those people or keep them from having babies. And for centuries in this country, that has been the predominant approach. Or at least it's been a strain of policy that has kept this country from instituting radical social change and transformations that would end white supremacy and end racist inequities in this country.
Outstanding. Professor Dorothy Roberts, Northwestern University. I wanted to ask because I think many non-white people, and that's one of the reasons that I have Justice co-hosting now on the program, many non-white people have deficiencies in language as a result of the system of white supremacy and education being withheld, or inequities in education, that non-white people really have struggles in terms of reading a lot of the books that come out of colleges and universities and understanding. So it would be helpful if you can break down, because I know some of the non-white listeners, before this program, they were curious about your work and they didn't really understand what eugenics is. Do you think you could explain that for our listeners?
Sure, yes.
Your idea.
Yes, okay. Eugenics is a philosophy about society and human beings. It's a way of thinking that says that people inherit not only their physical traits, but their personality and even their moral character from their parents. So these characteristics are passed on generation to generation to generation. And the reason why there are certain problems in society, like why there is poverty, why some people don't get a good education and don't, aren't as smart as other people, eugenicists would say, why there's crime. All of these problems, eugenicists said, were caused by people inheriting bad traits from their parents. And so if somebody commits a crime, it's because they inherited traits that made them criminals. If somebody had an alcohol problem or substance abuse problem, it's because they inherited addiction from their parents. If somebody was poor, it was because they inherited laziness from their parents. If somebody couldn't learn or did not know how to read and write at grade level, or they would use IQ tests and say they just didn't score high enough that showed that they had lacked intelligence, that was because they inherited that stupidity from their parents. They also had a term they like to use, feeble-mindedness. Just, somebody who didn't, it covered all sorts of things. It was just a term they used for people who they didn't like their behavior. They would say, well, they were feeble-minded, and they inherited that from their parents. So the first aspect of eugenics is this belief that all problems you see in society are caused by people inheriting bad traits from their parents. And so then the next step in eugenics is to say, well, if that's the case, then we can improve society if we just keep people who have those traits from having children. Then they won't be passed down. And we can improve society also if we encourage the people who have the good traits to have more children. And so according to eugenicists, it was important for the government to institute policies that would do that. Even very harsh policies, brutal policies like sterilizing people. If you have an institution full of feeble-minded people you've deemed feeble-minded, well then the state should be able to tie them down and sterilize them so they can't have children. And we should keep people like that from coming into the country. We should keep them from marrying. So there were a whole host of policies that were intended to keep people who were deemed to be genetically inferior from having children. And then that also led to the flip side of that, which is it's a waste of money to try to educate these people. It's a waste of money to have social programs for them. It's a waste of money to have social programs to try to lift people out of poverty because they're born that way. You can't change them. And so an important part of eugenic thinking is there's no point in social change because society isn't the problem. It's these people's bad genes that are the problem. And all the effort should be on just keeping them from having children, not trying to improve their social conditions because it's not the social conditions that are the problem, it's them that's the problem. And this was the premier way of thinking of biologists and policymakers in the 1920s and 30s. In fact, the people in your audience are probably familiar with the Nazis and their hygiene programs where they, before exterminating Jews and others they thought were defective, they had policies to try to keep people, Jews and gypsies and others that the Roma people and other people they felt were inferior, to keep them from having children. Well, the Nazis got these ideas from American eugenicists. There was a correspondence between the Americans who were developing this philosophy and instituting these policies and Nazis in Germany. And so whereas many Americans are aware of the Nazi regime and its horrible consequences, those same Americans are completely unfamiliar with similar policies. They did not end in the mass exterminations of people as they did in Nazi Germany, but they began with this same philosophy that there are defective groups of people who the government has a right to keep from having children in order to improve society. And that philosophy continues today in many ways. Many people who do know about the eugenics era think, well, it ended after World War II when people condemned the Nazi atrocities. That led to a discrediting of eugenics thinking. But in many ways, that basic philosophy, again, I think it's so important, so I'm going to repeat it again. I think it's critical to understand this basic philosophy that social inequality is caused not by unequal social systems and structures, but by the innate defects of the people who are at the bottom. That philosophy continues today. The bell curve was an explicit, lengthy attempt to support that philosophy with so-called scientific evidence. It was a bestseller in the 1990s. There are, and as I said, there is now a resurgence in interest in showing that race is biological. And I think many of the people who are doing that today will say, but we're not going to attach to it the idea of racial inferiority. But it's important to recognize that if you believe it's all biological, you will not have the definition of white supremacy you started in this program. Your definition was a political definition. It wasn't a biological definition. And if you believe that races are biological, it's a short step to believing that the reason why we see social differences among races is because of some innate biological reason, not because of white supremacy and all the institutions and systems and stereotypes and theories and sciences that have supported it for centuries.
Outstanding. I wanted to ask, because with the whole eugenics movement that you touched on from the early 1900s, we see remnants of that today, as you touched on, and one of the key remnants is Planned Parenthood. And you spend a great deal of time in your book talking about Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood and the impact that they had on black people and making an effort to control the reproduction of black people in this area of the world. Could you inform our listeners about who Margaret Sanger is, her connection to Planned Parenthood, and just how you see that relationship to racism, white supremacy with her work and the organization known as Planned Parenthood?
Well, Margaret Sanger was a nurse who, in the 1920s, was a champion for birth control and is widely seen as the founder of the birth control movement in this country and a heroine for many people who are reproductive choice advocates today. And, it's hard to know exactly what her motivations were decades ago. I believe that she did have a concern for poor women who were having baby after baby after baby without any ability to control their own childbearing. And I do want to make it clear that I think it is important for women to be able to control their own childbearing. And I think that was an aspect of her campaign. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, her campaign was started in the midst of the eugenics period, and she, for whatever reason, probably because it gave her a lot of credibility and financial support, she joined with eugenicists like the Birth Control Federation of America to promote birth control in this country. And many of her writings express a eugenic rationale, a eugenic reason for birth control. And so she opened clinics around the country, birth control clinics, but she also opened the first birth control clinics for Black Americans. There was one in Harlem. Now, again, it's important to note that Black women and men in New York were asking for contraceptives. Her first birth control clinic was open for white women, and there was a demand for birth control. I mean, Black people, women and men, W.E.B. Du Bois, for example, was an advocate for birth control. So it wasn't as if she was pushing this against the will of Black people, but the problem was that she justified it in her writings as a way of limiting the Black population and limiting people who should not be having children from having children, as opposed to sticking with the view that this was an empowering technology so that women could take control of their own lives. And the Birth Control Federation of America was a eugenic organization, and it is developed eventually into the modern organization Planned Parenthood. Now, that's the origins of Planned Parenthood. Again, I don't want to say that that is Planned Parenthood's current philosophy, although there are people involved with Planned Parenthood who do have a very eugenic philosophy. It's a struggle that I think people within Planned Parenthood are engaging in to try to rid the organization of that philosophy. That is a struggle, the struggle between the view of birth control as a form of population control and the view of birth control or contraceptives as a form of empowerment for men and women that has to be connected to social justice. There has been a campaign waged primarily by women of color to move the way that we think about reproduction, contraceptives, abortion, other family planning in general, away from a population control view toward a reproductive justice view. And there have been many victories in this area recently. Since I wrote Killing the Black Body, I think many, many more people understand reproductive choice as not just a matter of individual choice, but a matter of social justice that affects entire groups of people and is part of a more holistic view of injustice, inequality, white supremacy, anti-racism in America.
Want to make sure, Justice, do you have any questions that you would like to ask?
I have two questions.
Go right ahead.
What do you mean by inheriting?
Inheriting? Oh, okay. Well, today we know that many aspects of our bodies come from our parents through the genes that our parents pass down to us. Have you learned about DNA and genes at all in school yet, or just maybe even from just watching TV or talking to people? You know that the way you look, for example, comes from your mother and your father, right?
No, I didn't.
No?
Well, wait. Can you say that one more time?
Yeah, okay. Some aspects of the way you look come from your mother and your father. Did you ever think about that? That children look a little like their parents?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's what I mean by inheriting, and that comes through genes. Sometimes they're called the building blocks that pass on information from parents to children to help to determine how children will look and sometimes what illnesses they have. Now, I'm very careful to say help to determine, because a lot of people think that you inherit everything from your parents and it's a done deal when you're born. It's you can just look at your genes and know what you're going to be like, what you're going to look like, how healthy you'll be. I don't think that's true, even though that idea is being pushed on the American public very heavily, so that I think it's hard to read a paper or watch a TV show or talk to people without hearing this idea that DNA determines your health, your looks, and increasingly people are saying your personality. And I think that that's just wrong, and I think most geneticists would back me up. Your DNA determines, it helps to determine these aspects of you and your life, but it always, from the very beginning, is influenced by your environment. And so by itself, DNA never determines anything. Only in I think there may be some rare cases where you could say if you have a particular gene variant, something is going to happen. But it's even with illnesses, your diet, even the diet of your mother when she was pregnant with you, other genes you might have, the kind of health care you get, all of this also shapes, I think even more than your DNA, how healthy you are, how much you learn, what you're interested in, what your personality is like. And so what I was saying about eugenicists is that they believed everything about you was inherited, came from your parents. So when you were born, they would say they could tell from when you were born, the day you were born, they could tell whether you were smart, whether you were pretty, whether you were a good person, whether you would commit crimes, whether you would drink too much, whether you would like sports, whether you'd be good at sports. They thought they could tell everything about you. And there are people today who think that. And more, there are companies that are being formed that claim that they can tell from when a child is little whether they'll be an athlete and whether they're going to do well in school and whether they're going to be, whether they're going to be in a gang. In fact, there was a study that came out recently that claimed they could tell genetically who was going to be a gang member and who wasn't.
Wow.
And this is, I think, when you have these trends that we're seeing today where everything practically is being attributed to DNA, and you have a trend that says we can tell people's race biologically, that we're going to see people put these two together and say, well, we can tell that a black child is going to do poorly in school and be a gang member from the day they're born. And again, why bother to improve the schools? Because it's determined in this child's genes. So That's what it means for something to be inherited. And yes, we know, so let me give you another example, Justice. You know that, you see a child and you can look at their parents and say, oh yeah, I see, her father's nose, and I see that maybe her skin color is a combination of the two parents, and oh yeah, her eyes look like her mother's eyes. But you can't tell from the parents whether the child is going to be a doctor or a teacher or a business person or a thief. You don't know. You don't know if the child is going to like to swim or to read or to fly airplanes. I mean, you just don't know. You can't tell those things because the child is born with certain genes that she inherits from her parents, which explains why you can see those resemblances. But most of what matters to that child is going to be determined by the society that she lives in, not by the genes she's born in. And my fear is that more and more we're being told that black children's and other non-white children's and white children's futures are determined by the genes they have when they're born, not by the society they live in. And I think that is extremely dangerous because it not only justifies the horrible inequities in our society, but it also tells people there's no point in advocating for social change. White supremacy is in our genes, and there's nothing to be done about it. And that, again, that idea that white supremacy is natural, that has existed since the 1700s at least. But it's also important that it was invented. That idea was invented around the end of the 1600s. The idea that white supremacy is a God-given right. It used to be in religious terms, and then science came in and came up with all sorts of justifications to say it's natural. That idea that it's natural for white people to have power and it's natural for black people to be servants. That was developed to justify colonialism and slavery and to explain why you could have a country that has the Declaration of Independence that says all men are created equal, that we all have an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and yet you have slaves. How could you explain that? The only way to explain that was, well, they are naturally slaves. We didn't make them like that. That's how they're born. And that's the same, if you notice that same philosophy, everything I've been saying, it runs through all of these systems, all of these policies and these ways of thinking, that social inequality is natural. It's such a powerful and devastating way of thinking, and many people still think that way today. And in fact, there is, I think, and this is what my new book is about, a trend that is saying we can now prove it through new genomic techniques.
Wow. Justice, you said you had two questions. Do you have?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem. Nope, this is fantastic information. I'm sure listeners are pleased to get constructive information and are learning a lot, because I know I am, and I read your book. So, Justice, you said you had two questions, so you have another one?
Yes, I do.
Can you speak up a little bit, Justice, so we can hear you clear?
Yes. When you were talking about Americans, what do you mean by Americans?
I was referring to, it might depend on exactly what I was describing as American, but I was referring to the United States, and to, I may have been referring to official policies of the United States government, or practices within the United States. If I said Americans, I was probably talking about the people who live in the United States, and I may have made some statements where I was talking about a majority of people or the dominant way of thinking. And, you know, for all of the policies that I've mentioned that have been official policies or dominant policies in the United States, there has always been resistance to those policies as well. As I mentioned with the idea of population control, there have always been people who have advocated against it. I mentioned the movement for reproductive justice led by women of color to change the focus on population control, or to eliminate it, but to change the way we think about reproductive freedom away from population control toward one that includes social justice as a necessary element. So I may have been referring to a dominant way of thinking about of these policies in the United States, the United States of America.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have another question or questions, Justice?
I do not have any more questions right now.
Okay. Please continue to think of some, and I will definitely check out to see if you've thought of some other good questions. Professor Roberts, I wanted to touch on, because I thought this was very interesting and important to share with our listeners. In your book, Killing the Black Body, you talked about the whole sad episode of crack babies and persecuting primarily black mothers who used crack cocaine during their pregnancy, and the attack where this was criminalized, and many attorneys, district attorneys, sought to press charges, in some cases felonies, and said that a primarily black female who uses crack during her pregnancy can be convicted of distributing drugs to a minor, which is a felony. You talked about that in your book, and I thought it was very important because you touched on the fact that a lot of the information around this, not only was it couched in very racist white supremacist terms and images, but a lot of the statistics about the damage done to infants born with crack cocaine in their system was incorrect, and that they, you know, it seems from your book suggests that was grossly inaccurate in the reporting about how much damage and the long-term effects of children who are born with crack cocaine in their system, or born to mothers who used crack cocaine during their pregnancy. Could you talk about that, and just how that seems to suggest another way that racism, white supremacy is attacking black females reproductively?
Yeah. Well, I think what happened with black women who used crack while pregnant at the end of the 1980s into the 1990s is a good example of the way that racism and white supremacy affect both criminal justice policy in this country and reproductive health policy. This was a time when crack cocaine first came on the scene in inner cities in the United States, and the press portrayed crack cocaine as a drug that was a black drug and very differently from cocaine. It was portrayed as a national crisis that required strong law enforcement. And one aspect of it was to develop this myth of the crack baby who was always portrayed as a black baby. So it was this idea that babies born to mothers who have drug problems are crack babies. In other words, the only babies that were affected by drug use by pregnant women were babies whose mothers smoked crack. When, of course, we know in this country before crack ever hit the scene that there were pregnant women who drank alcohol, smoked marijuana, used heroin, whatever, a multitude of drugs. But that wasn't highlighted as a criminal problem, as a crime. And then it was also the way that these so-called crack babies were presented, not as innocent children who are affected by drugs, but as a threat to society. So there were newspaper articles that warned that there was going to be these hordes of crack babies entering the public schools, predicting that they were all going to be on welfare, predicting they were going to cost huge amounts of money for medical care, predicting they were going to become criminals. There was one article I cite where they called them a bio underclass. And so it's just an example of racist stereotypes that singled out this one type of child affected by drug use who was portrayed as black, but also portrayed to have problems that no other baby affected by maternal substance abuse had. So not just health problems, but social problems. There was this myth that it was supposed to affect their brain so that they were incapable of social relationships, healthy social relationships. They were incapable of learning. And so that myth by itself is so damaging because it told the public that to expect that a black child was probably affected by crack and would not be able to learn and was going to become a social pariah or criminal or welfare dependent in the future, painting a whole generation of black children as a threat to American society. So then, after that myth was developed, and by the way, you mentioned that this was a myth. I mean, there was absolutely, first of all, no evidence that you could predict that a baby whose mother smoked crack cocaine was going to have all these problems. And then secondly, the studies that were done showing health problems among these babies were extremely poorly constructed. They just looked at the babies and saw that they had high rates of low birth weight, high rates of premature birth, and then the problems that follow from that. But black babies in this country in general have high rates of low birth weight and premature birth. It's not because their mother smoked crack, it's because of the social conditions that poor black mothers live in this country, including living under the stress of racism, which increasingly we're finding in better studies affects the health of children. So the studies, they have been completely discredited now. But there was supposedly the basis for this myth of the crack baby that then led prosecutors to go on a rampage against poor black women who had a crack cocaine problem to not get them treatment, but to prosecute them for crimes. And around the country, prosecutors were charging these women with an assortment of crimes, including felony child abuse, assault with a deadly weapon, and distribution of drugs to a minor. The last one was based on the theory that after the baby was born, but in the seconds before the umbilical cord was cut, that the mother was pumping a cocaine metabolite to the baby through the umbilical cord, and that was a drug offense, distribution of drugs to a minor, legal drugs to a minor. And these women were treated horribly. In South Carolina, at a medical university there, about 40 women were tested and arrested either during a prenatal care visit or right after they gave birth to their baby. Some women were literally taken in handcuffs and leg shackles, still bleeding from the delivery, to the jail. And other women were kept imprisoned while they were pregnant and brought to the hospital in shackles for their prenatal care, and then kept shackled to the bed during the delivery of the baby. And then, of course, these babies were taken from the mothers and placed in foster care. Or some of them, there was a huge problem of what was called border babies, where babies were just kept in the hospital in rows of beds because their mothers were considered unfit to take care of them. And you have to wonder if some of these social issues that the nurses claim to see, that the babies were unresponsive and weren't bonding, maybe had to do with the fact that they were lying in a hospital bed instead of being nursed and cared for by their mothers. So it was an extremely damaging policy that I argue in Killing the Black Body was essentially punishing these women for having babies. It wasn't about protecting the babies. If the states were concerned about the health of these babies, they should have been getting the mothers drug treatment and supporting the mothers as they cared for the babies, not taking the babies away from their mothers and throwing their mothers in prison. Now, you don't care for newborns by taking them from their mother at birth and throwing their mother in jail. That's not how you show love and care for a child. I think this was all about punishing these women because it was felt that they did not deserve to have children. And out of these prosecutions came some very harmful policies that affect all women in the state potentially, like in South Carolina, where a judge held that a fetus was a child, a viable fetus was a child for purposes of the child abuse statute. Well, that means that any pregnant woman could potentially be charged with felony child abuse if a prosecutor can convince a jury she did something that risked harm to the baby. That could be that she was working, or that she was jogging, or whatever. It could be, who knows what it could be. But so it led to laws and policies that are very harmful to women in general. But the women who are most at risk for prosecution are poor black women.
again, Professor Dorothy Roberts, Northwestern University. I want to take some calls. If you would like to call in to ask Professor Roberts questions about her book or things she shared with us on the program, the number is 347-215-6071. Again, it's 347-215-6071. Before we take some calls, just wonder, because you have so many just incredible passages and just extraordinary amounts of constructive information in your book, Killing the Black Body. On page 186, you said that the belief that putting pregnant addicts in jail will help their children is grounded in a naive faith in the neutrality of the criminal justice system. Professor Kennedy's premise that blacks benefit from greater law enforcement overlooks America's history of using criminal laws to subjugate blacks. Slave codes created a separate set of crimes for slaves that were sanctioned by public punishment not applicable to whites and included behavior that was legal for whites. The law defined as criminal any conduct performed by blacks that threatened white supremacy, such as learning how to read and write. This is a direct quote from the book, page 186, Killing the Black Body. This is a book you all should go purchase and read. Very constructive information. Before we go to the phone lines, I wanted to ask, because you do mention Professor Randall Kennedy, he's at Harvard, and you talk about different black people who have been advocates of these programs to criminalize mostly black mothers who have used crack cocaine during pregnancy, and family caps on black families that are on welfare that have 4 children. And you address the black people who say, hey, these are good things. These are things that help the black family. This is not racism. This is, working against racism to help the black community. I was going to talk about that. I will give you the option to either address that or Norplant and all of the harmful effects that drug has had on black people. Whichever one you think is more important to share with our listeners, go right ahead.
Well, I'm glad you raised that issue because of blacks who disagree on these policies. I mean, there's always been disagreement within the black community about the best way to attack racism and white supremacy. There's a famous W.E.B. Du Bois debate with Booker T. Washington on what's the best way to lift up black folks after emancipation. Even we have black conservatives in this country who support very conservative economic policy, as well as blacks across the spectrum. So just like, the race does not necessarily determine the way that you feel about these issues or the way that you see as the best route to addressing racism and white supremacy. I think, though, that, and I'm finding this now with this new book I'm doing on genetics, there are blacks who have come out supporting a drug, the first race-based drug, a heart therapy for black people, on the grounds that it's good that finally the FDA is paying attention to black people's health issues. And I think Professor Kennedy at Harvard felt that these policies punishing black women were an effort to protect the children. But, part of my work, I hope, it really is directed not to, people who are staunch white supremacists and racists who aren't going to care what I say anyway. It's to people who want to see an end to white supremacy and racism, and in my view, may not understand how these systems work. So I think that part of what I like to do is say, to some people, I know your heart's in the right place, but you're not seeing clearly how this is working. I mean, first of all of these systems, the prison system, the foster care system, for example, if I see an institution that is state created, that is made up mostly of black people, I first have to be suspicious of it. Because we know that we have a history in this country of institutions being created separately for black folks that are inferior and that are designed to perpetuate white supremacy. You have to wonder, well, if it's so good, why aren't more white children in that system? You know what I mean? If it's so good, that's what I wonder about foster care. If foster care is so good for families, why don't we see white neighborhoods where 1 out of 10 children are in foster care? If we saw that, there would be a huge uproar, and people would see that it's destroying families. And so, Randy Kennedy, I think he means well, but I just think he's wrong when he sees law enforcement locking up black mothers as a way of protecting their children. You have to also ask, why do they choose that method? Aren't there other less harmful methods? You want to help, are there less harmful methods to do it? I ask the same thing with foster care. When most white families that have problems of child maltreatment, they are served by, I'm not saying adequately, because the social programs in this country are inadequate and shoddy. Health care, social welfare in general, it's bad for everybody. But it treats white people better. But part of what's important to understand is part of the reason why it's so horrific in this country, why we're behind every other industrialized country in terms of our healthcare system, our social welfare system, is because of racism and white supremacy. Because to maintain white supremacy, white people will accept an inferior institution if it maintains white supremacy. Well, W.E.B. Du Bois pointed this out in his book, Black Reconstruction, where he asked, why is it that poor white laborers didn't join with freed slaves to get better rights for workers in this country? And his answer was because the poor white laborers preferred to have what he called the psychological wage of whiteness, of white privilege, over joining ranks with blacks. And so they would prefer to have inferior benefits for labor if that's what it takes to maintain white privilege. And I think, for me, people have said, well, you see race and everything, but I really think that the answer, or at least an important answer to why we don't have universal health care in America, why we have a huge foster care system but less money spent on services directly to families, why we have the largest prison population in the world, is because of racism. And all of these institutions are seen as a way of maintaining white supremacy when they actually hurt. In the end, they hurt white people. But people may decide, though, that they would rather maintain a privilege, what Du Bois called a psychological wage, over good health care. If that good health care is going to extend to black people, they would rather have a bad health care system. Wow. And their system that extends to non-whites, that will improve the status of non-whites.
Wow.
Again, it's powerful. It's very powerful.
Yes.
That's why the focus of your program is so important. People, I find that people don't want to. They don't even want to mouth the words white supremacy.
Yes, ma'am.
I mean, people are afraid to say that. They don't want to acknowledge the continued power it has in our society. But how else do you explain the brutality and the inequities we have in America when people espouse freedom and equality, and they can believe that exists in America? How can you believe that exists and then read the statistics about black deaths, the infant mortality, black infant mortality rates, and the incarceration rates? How do people process that? It's a really a pathology. How can you process that? The only way you can process that, to me, is if it's natural. It seems natural, so you've been convinced that that's natural. That's just the way the world is.
Unfortunately, the evidence suggests that many people, as you said, do feel that white supremacy is natural, and this is the way it is supposed to be worldwide, whether it's black people being forcibly sterilized or locking up every other black male that we see. This is the way it's supposed to be to maintain the system of white supremacy.
And they may not. I think most people will not. They don't even. They'll say, I don't even know what white supremacy is. They'll say, of course I'm not. I don't believe in that. I don't support that. But they don't. It's because it's so natural. It seems so natural that they don't see it.
Mm-hmm. I particularly see that with non-white people, which is why I have this program and why I'm ecstatic that you came here. And again, we're auditioning to get you back, because if I didn't even know about the third book that you're working on now, but for sure, you need to come back to the program to share more information. I am certain people are listening in. I'm going to get to the phone lines now. Again, I'll give them the number so you can call in, 347-215-6071. When I go to the phone lines, please, no speakerphone, because it disrupts the quality of the program. I will call out whichever area codes that I see first and just go down the line. So when I call you out, have your question or comment for Professor Roberts, and we'll get to the phone lines. We're going to take a quick 1-minute commercial. Before I do that, I did want to ask very respectfully, Professor Roberts, what is your mother's name?
Iris.
Iris. Is it Roberts? Iris Roberts?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Definitely. We want to definitely take a moment of silence before I get to the commercial. Mothers are very important, and Iris Roberts, huge contributor to today's program, and having Dorothy Roberts here with us to share incredibly important information. Definitely want to take a moment of silence to recognize Iris Roberts and thank her for today's program as well. She was a major contributor. We're going to take a quick moment, one commercial, and we'll be right back.
Is racism hurting you? On issues of race, are you unable to speak, think, and act with clarity and confidence? Are you tired of laughing when nothing is funny, smiling when you are not happy, agreeing when you really disagree? At counterracism.com, You can learn specific strategies and techniques to counter the behaviors of the people who practice racism in all areas of activity, using words correctly, following counter-racist logic, even counter-racist science projects designed to reveal what racism is, how it works, and how to counter it. The open source code writing format allows you to pick and choose from a variety of counter-racist suggestions so you can produce the code that works for you. Stop by counterracism.com today and help replace racism with justice.
That's counter-racism.com.
As I suspected, this program has been very constructive. We have a ton of callers on the line. We're going to be very codified in how we do this. I'm going to call out the area code, ask your question or comment. Everyone who called in, you are on the line, so please be quiet so we can preserve the quality of the program so everyone can be heard. And please, no speakerphone. If you're on speakerphone, please, if you could turn that off, that would be very helpful. Thank you. I'm going to start at the top. 301. Are you there?
Hello, Gus. This is Jamal. How you doing?
I'm very well, sir. Go ahead and ask your question or comment, whatever you have, sir.
Yes. I wanted to ask a question about the eugenics. I kind of see it as like if I have a question, it's more like the sports. Like for instance, if you look at football, baseball, and basketball, I was on a train with a guy, and he was saying, "Man, I wish we had more white athletes that was at the top of the top of the sports again." And I asked him why, and he said, "Man," he just said, "I love black athletes, but I just like to see myself." Now I was looking at a program maybe a couple of years ago about something talking about trying to make your kid a better athlete, and these are mostly white people trying to figure out, well, how can I make my kid a better athlete? Hello? Hello?
Yes, sir.
I'm here.
Oh, and the question I ask is the eugenics thing is using to trying to find out how they can, better themselves instead of at the same time destroying us too?
Well, it's interesting you should bring up sports. Well, okay, so eugenics, I think when you say eugenics in particular as opposed to genetics. Eugenics has in it the idea that you are going to attempt to improve society by encouraging some people to have more children and discouraging others from having children. Now you could apply that to sports. So if you believe that a certain group is good at sports, you could encourage, and you want them to play sports more, you encourage them to have more children, if you believe that you can identify the genetic traits that make people better at sports. Nowadays you can select for genes, certain kinds of genes in an embryo and have that embryo implanted. And they're doing that now for certain diseases, but people who believe that genes determine sports ability, in the future might select for sports ability. Okay, but that's all based on, you have to believe, though, that sports ability is determined by genetics. And it's linked to race because people tend to point to sports to say, well, here's proof that race is biological. Right. Just look at the football teams and the basketball teams. They're filled with black people. That proves that there's some black gene for sports ability. It's only in black people. So black people must be biologically separate as a race. Well, the problem with that is that if you look across all sports globally, right, and you look at even particular sports like basketball historically, you will see that people of various different groups do well at various sports. And even in basketball, it used to be that Jews were stars of basketball in some places. Today, they're considered stereotypically not to be good at sports. They're good at other things. These are stereotypes that have developed that have to do with, as far as I'm concerned, the social conditions that push people into certain sports as opposed to others, and that make them want to do well at sports. I think that black people do well at basketball because they have access to basketball, and they have a huge incentive to do well at basketball. If they had as huge as incentives to do well at becoming the CEO of a company, they would do well at being a CEO of a company. But, you know, the skills for basketball are the same skills you need for volleyball. Why aren't black people dominating volleyball? Because nobody plays volleyball in their neighborhood.
Right.
You need a net. You need a net for volleyball, but you could go on the corner and see the basketball hoop.
Right. But,
I mean, it's the idea that it's linked to some race-based gene is just false. There are white people who excel at life. They excel at ice hockey, and they excel at swimming.
Right.
You know, we used to say, the Soviets excel at girls' gymnastics. Now, last year it was the Chinese who did. Well, did their genes change, or is it that the Chinese government put a lot of money into training Chinese girls to be good at gymnastics so they would excel when the whole world was watching them?
I have
Hold on 1 second, because we have a lot of callers. So if you can hang on the line, and
I was
going
to say the reason why I brought up that question is because of.
Well, hold on 1 second, because we have a lot of callers today. 954, are you there?
Yes. Hi.
Hi.
How are you? Okay.
I'm well.
This is good. This is Diva JC. And
Greetings.
I'm really enjoying this conversation. But I want to rewind, I don't have the doctor's name, Dorothy Roberts.
Dorothy Roberts.
Okay.
Robert.
Huh? I must read some of your books right now. I'm reading Houston Baker, Betrayal. I don't know if you're familiar with it, how black intellectuals have betrayed the black community. But right now, I want to say that everything that I hear you talking about goes back to male supremacy. Because in the beginning, a lot of women don't know, and somebody sent me an email saying that women created marriage for, to hold men down. Not true. Men created marriage to claim the children from the marriage who would work on their farms. That's how marriage got created. And the whole idea of separatism, competition, possession, and ownership is a male construct, whereas women are tied up with, nurturing, inclusion. I mean, on the overall, there are gray areas in both ways. But I want to say this, that what do you think about this influx of homosexuality where women are not being married to men? Men hold the purse strings, and women are moving further and further down on the economic rung because of this homosexuality. And even homosexual women don't have the money that homosexual men have. And black women are on the bottom rung of that, paradigm. What do you think about that?
Well, so first let me say that I agree with some of what you said, and I disagree with some of it. So I absolutely agree that white supremacy and patriarchy or male supremacy go hand in hand. And you're right that many of the policies I've been talking about are promoted by combining racism, white supremacy, and control of women. I mean, the reproductive justice issues I discussed, or the population control policies, are almost entirely, with some exceptions, policies that are about controlling pregnant women and controlling women's decision-making. So the reason why, part of the reason why they are in place is because of a history of male control of women's bodies and decisions. And I could, this is a point I'm making, Killing the Black Body, that it is a combination of white supremacy and patriarchy that permitted slave masters to control the bodies of their enslaved women that they owned. And I don't have time to go into all those, but I think for many of these policies I'm talking about, you're absolutely right that gender, sexism, male supremacy work together with white supremacy to enforce these policies. Now, I don't think, though, that you can attribute the women's poverty to homosexuality. That, if you take, for example, black women are not getting married, and part of why they're not getting married,
don't have no men.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
okay,
it goes hand in hand.
They're heterosexual, but the unemployment rates and incarceration rates of black women are so high that black women are not. They're not only are they not finding men that it would be economically feasible to marry, but if they marry these men, it's not going to improve their life economically. In fact, it may be an economic burden on them. And I'm not saying that at all to disparage the men. It's just a fact that their employment and prospects are so poor in many black communities. And so if they were economically better off, then marriage would be a means of improving the women's financial status. But I don't think that women should have to rely on marriage in order to be able to have the means to take care of themselves and their children. It's part of the. You started out with talking about how the institution of marriage, its purpose was not to benefit women. So we couldn't expect that marriage should be the answer to women's economic problems.
Well, but the burden.
Hold on 1 second. Hold on 1 second. Hold on 1 second, please. 954. Hold on 1 second.
Okay.
We have a lot of calls.
And you know what? I thought we were going to be on for about an hour, so I really am going to have to go in like 5 minutes or so.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. I didn't realize the program was so long. I'm sitting here in somebody's bedroom at their birthday party, and I haven't even seen.
My fault. We want you to get to the birthday party. If you could take one or two other calls, then we'll let you get to the party. Thank you for hanging out with us.
Sure.
Let's see. 916, are you there? 916? Okay. 313.
Good afternoon, Dorothy.
Hi, who's this?
This is Adwa. You don't know me.
Oh.
When I first looked at your book, the title of your book, The Killing the Black Body, I didn't think that it was just primarily centered around women and the desecration of women. But I just wanted to add to this, Dorothy, is that I'm in Detroit, Michigan, in urban concentrated poverty. And I have noticed that I see a large number of amputee men, black men, who have their legs amputated. I've even seen them all the way up to the waist. And I'm saying every day I see going and coming, because I use the bus, I see men, 2 and 3 wheelchairs on the bus, and they don't have appendages. And I'm wondering, I know you're dealing with female, but this also impacts our men.
Oh, sure, yeah. Yes, right. So that, you're right, killing the black body, I was focusing on the population control policies targeted at women. What do you think do you think these are health issues? You think it's gunshot wounds?
I do not think they're health issues. I think that this is just what you're saying, killing the black body. I mean, what can a man do with no legs?
You know,
men look like they have been cut. They carry the bag for the waist. I don't think they have genitals.
You know what? I'm gonna look into this because I've talked about this third book I'm working on now on this rise in referring to race as a biological category, and one of my chapters is on this push for race-based medicine, which is linked to the argument that the reason why black people are in such bad state health-wise is because of our genes, as opposed to because of the racism, the poor health care, the environmental toxins, and on that are targeting us. And one statistic I came across is that, black people have lower rates of access to all sorts of helpful medical technologies, but we have a higher rate of amputation. In fact, I saw one quote that said that's the one type of surgery that black people have more is amputation. And that I'm going to look into that and see if there has been an increase. But that would suggest, if you've got amputated limbs, sometimes that's from diabetes, but it always suggests that you didn't have the preventive care that would have avoided the need for such a radical type of surgery on your body. And I think that's a sign of the poor and maybe worsening health care available to black people in America.
And when you do your study, can you look to see if it's a more predominant in the black man as opposed to the black woman? Because that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing more black men amputees. Yeah.
Okay. But, part of it, we have now, I mentioned before, the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world, actually in the history of Western civilization. Black men are incarcerated at higher rates than anybody else. And needless to say, health care in prisons is horrific. So I'm speculating now, I haven't done the study, but I wouldn't be surprised if, because there are so many black men incarcerated, that is taking a toll on their health. I did see a study recently that linked incarceration to death rates, higher death rates among black men. So if there's higher death rates linked to incarceration, certainly morbidity or disease rates and the consequences of it, like amputation, I bet are connected as well.
Right.
And I would be surprised if that has to do with mass incarceration. But thank you for raising that. You're going to see something about that in my book, definitely. Definitely, because it's a sign. It really, I don't want to call it a symbol because it's a real life, tragedy, but it really reflects the kind of damage, physical damage. These are life and death issues. This isn't just academic. People are dying because of these policies, or as you said, going around, with their bodies cut up. This is serious. That's why I think that this new trend of saying, it's there's something wrong. There was already something wrong with his body. That's why this happened to him. Is so dangerous. Because again, then it looks strange to you and me, but some people will say, that's just what happens to black people. They're inferior.
Do you have time for one last call, or do you? If you want to get to the birthday party, I totally understand.
Well, I also brought my son. He's roaming around somewhere. Handed him off the minute I got here.
Wow, if it's time to be a mom, I totally understand.
No, it's a good friend, so I'm not worried. But anyway, I guess I could take one more quick. I'll answer it quickly.
Okay, a quick comment. I have someone at 111. I don't know the area code. If you are there from 111 with a hand up and you pressed 1, do you have a question or a quick comment? Not hearing it. 414, are you there? Question or quick comment?
Yes, I'm here. I just wanted to ask Mrs. Roberts, what things can we do to, I guess, protect ourselves when we're going to the doctor?
Yeah.
Because go ahead.
No, go on.
Because I've been reading a lot of information about how now white people do not get the care that they need when they go to the doctor. They're not getting the same. So there are studies that have shown that. For example, non-whites getting less pain relief during surgeries. Getting different doses of medications on these theories that our bodies are different, or that we're more vulnerable to becoming drug addicts, so we shouldn't get, the pain-relieving drugs. All sorts of ideas that are based on the notion that black bodies are different, our skin is thicker. I mean, just all sorts of backward kind of ideas. And I think part of it sounds like you're already doing it, is just to be very informed. Okay.
You can get a lot of information online now, medical studies. You shouldn't believe everything that's online, but you can check if it's something published in a medical study. And sometimes they're hard to read, but sometimes they're not. I think I'm finding that I'm reading all sorts of genetic articles now, and articles related to biomedicine, and you can understand them. They're not that complicated, but you could try. Another is to have a doctor you trust, who you can run by what another doctor is proposing for you, and say, can I trust this advice? And just to be knowledgeable about it. And then also, that's what you can do personally. I think also then to be involved in these issues. We're going through healthcare reform now. What can we do as blacks and other non-whites, people of color, to have a say in this process, so that whatever the system is going to serve us and not treat us as poorly as we've been treated in the past.
Thank you.
Again, Professor Roberts, I am extremely grateful for you taking time out to share with us. I am certain that the folks tuning into this broadcast and downloading it are going to find it incredibly constructive, and yet as you can see, there's a lot of interest in hearing what you have to say. Definitely we'll be contacting you to see if we can have you back on the program to talk about your latest book and Shattered Bodies. Because I think a lot of folks would have to come back and talk about Shattered Bonds, and then maybe when my book is published, you can have me back to talk about that one. For sure. Yeah. Again, Northwestern University's Dorothy Roberts' incredible book, Killing the Black Body. Purchase it, read it, and look out for the next one. Also, Shattered Bodies. If you can get your hands on some of her essays. Shattered Bonds. If you can get your hands on some of her essays, those are incredibly constructive as well. Thank you again for taking time out. We will definitely be in touch soon. And I would like to get information on the studies that show the effects of racism, the adverse health effects, because I've been trying to get my hands on those. So if you can point me in the right direction, I will shoot you an email to get that information.
Send me an email to remind me, and that's going to be a whole chapter in my next book too. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yes, we will definitely be looking forward to having you back on the Cows as many times as you'd like to come back.
Okay. Thank you, and thanks for your program.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
We'll talk to you soon.
I have a quick question.
I'm sorry?
Hello?
I heard, was that you, Justice?
Yes, that was me.
We should have got your question in as the last one. Whoop, darn. You don't even worry about it, because Wednesday you will be front and center with questioning. That is my apologies for not getting you in for the last question. I wish you could have stayed a little bit longer. What was your question? I'm curious just to hear. What was your question, Justice?
My question was, does she have any other books for... Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
My question was, does she have any other books for 10-year-olds and 5-year-olds?
That is an excellent question. See, if you could have asked that, maybe that would have been that would have planted the seed for her to perhaps write some books for younger non-white people, so that they can start becoming informed about these issues. Because she talks about in the book that we mostly talked about today, Killing the Black Body, she talks about how white people who probably are practicing racism have gone into high schools and sterilized, and when I say sterilized, that means that you do an operation on a female and you make it so that she cannot have a child. That they were going into high schools and doing this to predominantly black females. These are people that are, 16 years old, 17 years old, not that much older than you. So, yeah, I don't think she has any books out for folks that are 5 or 10 at this point, but maybe that's something she should think about doing, because definitely it's something that impacts very young non-white people. 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds should start being informed about this, because it is important and it does have an impact on them. In fact, I will email her, because I want to get the information that she was talking about in terms of racism and how it affects non-white people's health. When I email her, I will send her that question that you think that. Do you think that would be constructive if she had books that were written for people that are your age, like 10 years old, 11, 12-year-olds, talking about this?
Yeah.
Okay. I will put that in the email, that you think she should perhaps think about getting some books out for younger non-white people so that they can get a better understanding of these issues. Did you have another question, Justice?
No, I do not have any more questions.
Oh, okay. Did you think the program was constructive?
Yes, it was constructive, but most of it I didn't understand it.
I was thinking the language might be a little bit high, not necessarily talking so that a 10-year-old could easily get it. I suspect as you get older, it will be a lot easier for you to understand the things she was talking about today, and it will probably be a lot more important to you as you get a little bit older. But as I said, Wednesday, this will not be a problem, because we will have a white person on the show Wednesday, so you will be asking a lot more questions. You're going to be starting the show asking questions, and we're going to make we're going to put much more effort into making sure that people talk so that you can understand on Wednesday, because we will have a white guest on Wednesday. So hopefully this will be, we'll do a better job on Wednesday.
Okay.
For sure. I think there's still a lot of people on the line, yes?
Hello?
Yes, I thought so. Does anyone else have comments or thoughts on the program?
Only thing I have is I wish you could have stayed.
Yeah.
I had a couple of questions about Jesse Owens and in the Olympics, and Hitler rolling out his first person, supposed to be the master. He's supposed to have the master race. So this was the time for him to show that the guy he had out was going to win all the events. I wanted to ask her that. So
Yeah, I definitely hope she can come back to hang out again, because she has a lot of work that focuses explicitly on white supremacy. She uses the term in her book all throughout the book, and that's.
And I wanted to ask another question about the virus that women get that causes cancer. I forgot the HV virus or something, and they're supposed to have a shot that they can give to young girls and mothers. I mean, young girls. I wanted to ask.
Hello?
Yeah.
I got a thought about that. It doesn't really protect against HPV because there are a lot of different types of HPV, and it really doesn't protect all of the ones that prevent cancer.
Is that a man that transmits that disease?
It can be transmitted both men and women. Men can get it too. And I thought that was kind of weird that they didn't develop something for males. That boggled me. Because males can't.
I think the guy, if you look at the tree man, that's what he had. Because his immune system wasn't able to fight at all. That's why he grew those warts and everything. That's what he caught.
Oh, okay.
And it's on if you want to, don't just take my word for it. It's on the Discovery Channel, and you can probably find out through Google.
Okay. But
go ahead.
I don't think young girls should get it. I just don't, because it doesn't really protect against, I really don't think.
Because they was, to dovetail what you were saying, they was advocating that in the some of the black high schools in the nation about getting that shot. And I saw even saw commercials with, black mothers and their teenagers on the commercial. Some drug companies, but I haven't seen it in a while. So.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. And they also, I was listening to Dr. Jewel Pookrum. She was also saying that the Depo shot, they were doing a lot of experiments on black women in Africa with the Depo shot. And she was saying that before, the Depo shot was just used on women who were retarded, and they felt the best option was to give that shot. But before, it was not recommended that women should get the Depo shot. But yeah, I wouldn't trust that HPV.
Is that Depo-Provera?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Professor Roberts. Go ahead.
I wouldn't trust that Depo shot either.
Professor Roberts has an extensive chapter about that in her book, where she talks about how it was tested on non-white people in other areas of the world, and all these harmful side effects about the drug, that and Norplant, and how these drugs were aggressively marketed to mostly black females, and sometimes they were even pressured into taking these drugs. Like they would go for sentencing, and it would be, you can either get a year on probation and take Norplant, or you can go to jail for 7 years. Like things like this to aggressively coerce non-white, mostly black females to taking these drugs that she says is pretty much like temporary sterilization. And they had all these harmful side effects and are real difficult to get out. She has a lot of information about Depo-Provera and Norplant in killing the black body. So anybody, if you're interested in getting more information about that and how it relates to racism, white supremacy, get Killing the Black Body. I also want to say, Saye, you are on the line, so if you would like to say something, feel free. Your mic is open. And everybody else who's on, your mic is still open. You can feel free to comment or question or what have you.
Greetings.
Greetings. Who is this?
This is 720.
720. How are you doing, sir?
Intensely victimized. How are you? Victim of racism.
Likewise.
I have something to add. is indirectly related to birth rates. I wish, my hope is that Mrs. Roberts will also be able to hear this. If she should hear the program again, I'll try to be brief. I don't know how we controlled, so to speak, our birth rates before taking on the ways of white people who work to maintain the system of white supremacy. But as far as consent and being informed and destroying families is concerned, I would be remiss if I didn't at least try to give this information. And with your co-host, particularly to you, Little Justice, and to all younger and older children, non-white children who are victims of the system of white supremacy. There were 4 young children who were in a mountain site and decided to jump into a near freezing lake to take a swim. They were not criminals. They were not gangbangers. They were not crack users. They were simply trying to do something constructive with their lives. However, they weren't well informed, I suspect, as a result of the system of white supremacy. That, and this is for all our non-white children, for all of you, they weren't informed that jumping into near freezing water would make their bodies so cold that they couldn't move their arms or legs anymore. So I hope this will be constructive information to all non-white children, so that perhaps we can increase our odds by at least one, so that we can get to have at least one more chance to even make a choice about children. Do not, Little Justice, and to all Robert's son, do not jump into near freezing water. Take this information. Do not jump into near freezing water, because it will make your body so cold that your arms and legs will not work in the water, and you will not be able to get out of the water. Do not jump into near freezing water. I hope that is constructive information. That's all I have to say.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing. I definitely think that is constructive. I would think for anyone, water safety, definitely important. I think white people put a lot of time and energy